Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we will cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. Hello, and welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. We've received feedback, and we continue to receive feedback from our listeners on topics they want us to cover, things they want to hear about, questions they have. Please keep those coming, and we'll keep answering those, and we'll keep covering those topics for you. If you have an idea, please reach out to us at podcast@blackdogled.com. Again, that's singular, podcast at blackdogled.com. Unfortunately, we may love our plants, but at the end of the day, we have to kill them to get what we want. And that's the life cycle of the cannabis plant anyway. So we're just kind of helping it along. But we thought it'd be appropriate to talk a little bit about how you know when the end of the life cycle is there, what to do, both flushing, taking down, how to go through the entire process. And a question we do get regularly is, how do you know when your plants are ready to go? So we're going to take all that and try and cover it briefly for you, give you some input. And then, of course, if you have any questions after you listen to this podcast, feel free to reach out to us for clarification on any of these points. So first off, we always talk about genetics are important for everything, and they're different. So your yields are going to be affected by genetics. Obviously, the smoke you're going to get out of it or the product you're going to get out of it is going to be very different if it's an indica or a sativa or a hybrid. The yields, the look of the flower is going to be very different. You get some of the spear buds, the very kind of large fist type buds. So genetics play a big role, and they do play a big role in when things ripen. You can talk to commercial growers and home growers that have been growing for a while and say, how long till your cannabis is ready? The knowledgeable growers will tell you that depends which strain I'm growing, because there is no definitive end. So the first thing that we will always tell you is know your genetics, know your plant. And the only way to do that is if you're cloning, and we understand a lot of beginners aren't going to have a veg and a flower and maintain genetics. So the other way is if you're buying a clone or getting a clone from a known source, hopefully it's a legitimate genetic, and there should be some information out there on the web or from the person you're getting the clone from that can tell you potentially when that plant would come down. Now, even inside of that, there's room for variability, because you could decide, hey, I want mine to be a little more uplifting. Let's say you got an indica, heavy indica, and you don't want it to be super couch lock. You might take it down on the earlier side. So if somebody says, hey, this is an 8 to 10 week strain, great. You want that indica maybe for your own medicine to be a little more uplifting. You're going to take it down maybe closer to 8 weeks, and not at the end of that 10 weeks when it might be a little more of a cerebral or a little bit more of a couch lock kind of effect. So there are things you can do. But let's assume for a moment you're not sure, or you want to learn your own genetic yourself. You have a new seed, or you got a clone, and you can look up that information, but you want to go through the process of learning yourself. You're going to grow this plant for a while. You're going to clone it. It's worth kind of getting in there and understanding the life cycle of your particular genetic, especially if you're going to grow that particular genetic for a while. So what would be, Kevin, do you think, the very first way that you would start to look? And let's throw out some guidelines here. I don't know, Kevin, do you know of any genetics? I mean, I've heard guys say, and I haven't seen personally, but I've heard as short as 7 weeks for ripening, especially, let's say we're not going to talk about autoflowers at all. We're talking about day lengths instead of autoflowers are different. There's some really fast finishing stuff. Let's stick with traditional things you can clone and top and whatnot. So what's the shortest you hear or you believe?
I've heard rumors of 6 weeks. Never seen that myself, but certainly rumors of 6 weeks. And as you pointed out, it also comes down to a matter of preference in terms of ripeness. So the people that are harvesting at the end of 6 weeks may be taking it down a little bit earlier than most people would actually like it in terms of ripeness. Or it could be that they have one particular standout strain that just happens to ripen up very, very quickly. I know in what we've played around with, we've seen strains that are clearly 8-week strains and strains that clearly take 11 or 12 weeks to get ripe. So there's quite a bit of variation and variability. But 6 weeks would certainly be an extreme outlier.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good point about what you want, because all of this, don't let anybody tell you for a fact, unless I don't know of anybody I've met yet that I can take everything they say as fact when it comes to growing cannabis. But don't let me tell you there's hard and fast rules. Take everything with a little grain of salt and use your own thoughts to take that information and take it don't just take it as a fact. That's all I can say, is because I have people, let's take the, like Kevin said, preference. When I'm going to smoke cannabis, I prefer a little drier flower. Some people like it moist. It's just the way I like it to burn. It's just the way I like it. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. Now, there are people that are adamant about the humidity levels of their held cannabis, and they'll swear it should be held at this, and I'm fine with that. But when I'm getting ready to smoke it, I might move it to another jar and get it drier. That's a personal opinion, and that should permeate your grow. You should have some of your own personal opinions. These are living things. There's room to play with that. So back to what Kevin said is, yeah, you can have, a personal opinion on when you want to take it down. Something else we should point out is when you take it down does affect how the chemistry of that flower is, whether it's going to be uplifting or not, some of those things. But also, as we talk about all the time, right, Kevin, if you take down early, you could be sacrificing weight, right? Because they're going to put on a lot of the flowers, not all, again, genetic dependent. A lot will bulk up near the end specifically, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very strain dependent, but a lot of strains will actually produce what I would call ripe, ready to take down flowers. And if you leave the plants to be, they will just continue pushing out more and more and more flowers. So your weight actually starts going up over time by not harvesting them. And that could be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing because then you've also got some overripe flowers on there. They can start being a magnet for mold and pests and other things. So there's definitely a balancing act involved there. But a lot of times people take down very early because they want to take down early and get another run started. But if they'd left it on for 4 or 5 more days, they could have gotten significantly more weight. Now, probably not double, but maybe 10, 15% more, because a lot of times as the plants are reaching the end of their natural life cycle, they realize they're about to die, especially if you're doing things to encourage them to feel that way, such as flushing them with plain water instead of giving them nutrients and maybe dropping the temperature. And a lot of those things signal the plant, hey, the end is coming, and the plant does everything it can to push out as many flowers as it possibly can because it's trying to reproduce before it passes away.
So that's a great point, Kevin. Why don't we talk a little bit before we dive into how to check it in our own garden? If we left things alone in nature, and this plant was growing outside back in the old days when it was growing in the countryside all over, what would happen in nature?
Well, cannabis is an annual temperate plant, so it is adapted to not being in the tropics. It's adapted to being in a temperate zone where there is an actual winter every year. So that's why it is day length sensitive. It knows that during the middle of the summer, it can grow all at once, but as soon as the days start getting shorter, it needs to go into flower because it needs to flower and ripen up seeds before winter arrives. So that's why the change in light cycle actually triggers it to flower. And then if you give it other indications that it would naturally get in nature, such as not just the short day length, but also cooler temperatures and running out of nutrients, that encourages the plant even more to feel like, ooh, the end is coming and I need to flower as much as I possibly can. Especially if you're frustrating these plants by not giving them pollen, they just keep trying to flower and flower and flower because their goal is to produce seeds. Their goal is not to produce flowers for you. They want to produce seeds, and you're frustrating them by not pollinating them, but they just keep trying to flower.
So all we're really trying to do, if I'm understanding, is we're just trying to work with the natural life cycle and encourage it in our own gardens, indoors or out if you're an outdoor gardener. Obviously, the difference is we do want the flowers and not the seeds. So we're trying to tweak that a little bit for our benefit. But so now that we know that's what we're trying to do, we're trying to accomplish what's going to happen naturally in nature. We should be both participating and observing. So we're helping it along, but also working with the plant, not against it. So what do you feel? And we've all heard so many different ways. So let's for the sake of argument, say most of cannabis is going to ripen somewhere between 7 and 10 weeks, just for the sake of discussion. If you don't agree with that, please don't tell us. I'm sure you have a plant that is ripe in 6 days. Good. That's awesome. But let's just, for the sake of discussion here, say we've got a 7 to 10 week window. Now I've got plants. I've never grown this genetic before. Let's say I've got a grow kit. I'm in there and I'm getting to week 6, 7. What would I do with our grow kit? Or what would I do with equipment, or what would I do as a process to start to observe the plant and see if it's getting ready to harvest or if I should be there?
Right. So if you haven't grown the strain before and you don't know how it behaves for you, then what you want to do is start looking at the trichomes on the leaves and on the flowers and started paying attention to them and observing what they're doing, because trichomes are a good proxy indicator of how ripe the flowers are. And ultimately, what you're actually going for in the flowers is not the flowers, but the trichomes. That's where most of the terpenes and the cannabinoids are actually stored. So when you look at the trichomes, you'll notice that immature trichomes that you look at when the plant is in the third week of flower, for example, tend to be entirely clear. If you look at them under a microscope, you see that the little head on the top of the trichome looks entirely clear. As they start to mature more, that head will turn to a milky color. And then finally, as it gets even more ripe, it turns to an amber color, and then finally brown, and then it finally falls off. Now, once you've gotten to the it fell off stage, it's probably overripe because you just lost pretty much everything you wanted that trichome for when the tip fell off. So our goal is to make sure that that doesn't happen. And if you start looking at your plants and you see that all the trichomes are falling apart, then you probably went too long or did something else horribly wrong to the plant. But if you've never grown a strain before, around week 7, what I would do is start looking at it with a hand lens or a microscope. And if you start seeing a bunch of milky trichomes or amber trichomes, then it's entirely possible that you have a very early ripening plant. Most of the time, though, you're going to look at it at 7 weeks and you're going to see, maybe 5-10% milky trichomes and 90 to 95% clear trichomes still, indicating that plant probably still has a couple weeks to go.
And so one thing you pointed out there is that, you can go too far. So that is important to note, is you can't just leave it there. You also spoke earlier, if you go too far, you're going to attract, maybe become a magnet for disease or pest or something like that. So it is critical to stay on top of this. And we're going to talk in a moment about flushing. So part of the problem is flushing takes time. And if you wait till they're ripe to start flushing, you've kind of missed your window. You need to start flushing, as Kevin said, as you're observing some of that trichome production take place. And one other thing there is, as Kevin's talking about, early trichomes, just so you don't freak out, when you look through a microscope, if you're looking early, the head is one of the part of the development cycle. So when you look at early trichomes, they're going to look more like a spike. They're not going to have that mushroom top, and then they will develop the mushroom top and then go through the life cycle that Kevin spoke about. But so if you go real early, even 2-3 weeks, you might see a lot of spike ones. Don't worry, those will turn into actual mushroom top head type things, and then go through the cycle of the clear to milky to amber and whatnot. But just want to point that out. So, but what we do want is a lot of trichomes. We want to see a frosty forest of trichomes on there. And as Kevin said, we want to observe them. Now, getting back to what I said before, there is no definitive answer. Don't let anybody tell you need to harvest with 10% amber trichomes. That's bullshit. That's just not the way it is.
It's a rule of thumb, but it's not something that necessarily applies in every case.
Yeah, it's a good rule of thumb if you haven't tested it yourself. You might try taking down with 5% and 15 or 20% and 10%. And smoke it yourself. And you can, just so you know, you can do this with one plant. You can flush it a little early and pick buds off, cut particular buds off as they're hitting different levels of maturity. So you could take one plant and do your own test to see what you like.
And realistically, that is the only way to be sure about what you're going to be getting at different harvest times with that particular strain. So if you are going to be running that strain again, over and over again, the first time you run it, that's the best way to figure out the next time when you should actually harvest it, is just take samples starting, at 7-8 weeks, and take a small bud off every week or every 3-4 days, set it aside, label it, and try them yourself later. And you can figure out pretty quickly which one is what is ideal for you.
Yeah, and that's different for everyone. So don't let anybody tell you how to run your garden. Do it, live and learn yourself. But it is good to grab some of these guidelines. As Kevin said, these rule of thumb are helpful. So, we do kind of observe the 10% rule with most of ours, unless we're trying to do something different. But we do use 10%. But again, it's not a hard and fast rule. So now let's say we've been checking our trichomes. They're not 10% amber, but we're seeing that shift. We're seeing a lot of milkiness, maybe a little amber here and there. And we know we should be flushing. Now, flushing is an interesting topic because a lot like curing, I don't think it's very well developed in that it's hard to find definitive answers. And I just said there aren't hard and fast rules, but there are, I believe, as research occurs, we will have some better scientifically sound and validated answers as to what's going on in different processes, such as drying and curing. I believe some of that holds true in the flush cycle. I've heard so much when I hear I ask a lot of people I trust their opinion, and I hear vastly different answers and a lot of different answers. That tells me that we haven't settled on the right process or method yet. But the rule of thumb that I would throw out that I hear from talking to a lot of people is minimum is 7 days to get a good flush in. And again, let me back up here and say I'm talking about something that would hold nutrients, unlike a straight water medium where you're doing aeroponics or you're doing you're doing kind of a ebb and flow maybe, or even a deep water culture. That's different because you can flush rather rapidly in that because you're not holding on to as much. So let's say, just again for the sake of this topic, we're going to talk about either cocoa or soil or something like that.
Well, and it's important to understand what flush is trying to do, and it's basically you're trying to deny the plant nutrients to ensure that the plant does not have an excess of nutrients in its tissue when it harvests, as well as to start signaling the plant in yet a different way that, hey, the end is coming. Push your last efforts into trying to reproduce now to bulk up that final little bit. So there's a reservoir of nutrients in a media, like Noah just mentioned, with a soil or a cocoa media. That media can hold on to nutrients. Rock wool can hold on to nutrients. And so you need to flush that out. But there's also a reservoir of nutrients in the plant itself. So it's not just the case that you intend to harvest later this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and start my flushing right now because I'm in a hydroponic system. There's no media. That's not going to work. It takes time for the plant to actually exhaust its own internal supply of nutrients as well.
It's just going to be a little faster, correct, in hydro than we can do
because you don't because it's not getting any new nutrients from the hydroponic reservoir. As soon as you switch it over to just water, it has no access to new nutrients. Whereas in cocoa or in soil, even if you use a flushing agent, it's going to take several times flushing to finally get rid of all the nutrients out of that media.
And let's go into that. There are some strategies. So going back to what Kevin said, the main reason we're going to flush here is to signal it. But for us and most growers, the big reason is to reduce the harshness. So you've probably at some point in your life smoked some cannabis flower that was harsh, that you smoked, and it wasn't bad tasting or anything, but as soon as you took it in, you wanted to cough. It was just kind of had a harshness to it. That could be genetic and stuff, but often it's really just too much nutrients in there, too much salt still in the plant, and we end up with a harsher smoke. And obviously that's what we want to avoid. Now, part of the cure process helps with smooth smoke as well, but definitely flushing will encourage that smoother smoke. So if we understand why we're doing it, part of a good thing to recognize is what we're actually trying to accomplish. As Kevin said, you've got kind of two reserves. You've got the plant itself and the media. And so if you step back and think about it without knowing a lot about what we're talking about, you can think, okay, I've got these salts and these nutrients mixed in the soil. They're attached to the soil. They're embedded in the soil, and I need to get them out. We've all cleaned things. We've all dealt with salt buildup or some kind of heavy water buildup in our bathrooms or something. So you know that what we're going to do is we're going to try and get it moist, get it to move around, and then we're going to try and remove it from there. So one of the better strategies is to do early and often. So what we would do is, instead of just doing a flush every time, as Kevin said early on, to really get things moving and to really start to strip it out of the soil or the cocoa, is to get that out so that then we can let the plant go through it and exhaust its reserves, as he was talking about. So we've learned, and we believe, that doing a big flush your first one or two times is critical to really start that process and jumpstart it. And something that we've also learned and that Kevin's brought to the table is, by doing it once, if I'm going to put 40 gallons into a grow of water to flush it out, and Kevin will go over in a minute what you would use for that maybe, but let's say we're going to do that, we would apply maybe 20 gallons, get all that water through, get good run through, get that water off, wait a little bit, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, then go back and hit it with a second 20 gallons. So it's really had a chance to mobilize some of those salts.
And really the reason why you want to do that is kind of the same reason if you've ever had to wash dishes. Sometimes if you've got material that's burnt on or cooked on, it's easier to just let it sit in the sink and soak for a while, and then it's much easier to remove. So you can try flushing with tons of water up front all at once, but realistically that's not going to mobilize and get rid of the excess salts in the soil, as well as if you get the soil extremely wet to begin with and then let it soak for a while. And that soaking process will help loosen up a lot of those salts. And then you come back a few hours later and you flush again.
So Kevin, what would you use to do this flush, whether it's the first one and a double or whatever, or down the road? What do you generally like to use for flushing?
Just plain water. Generally, we will adjust the pH of the water if need be. Typically, you don't want to use water that has extremely high salt levels. So, for example, if you are in an area, you're on a well, and the water is very hard, has very high dissolved solids in it, probably has a high pH as well, then it would be ideal to filter that water and run it through your RO unit, which you're probably having to do just to water your plants normally in that case. Now, if you're living in an area where you've got relatively clean water, oftentimes it'll come out of the tap with a higher pH than what we want, and that can really cause a shock to the plant. If you've been fertilizing it with pH 6.3 water the whole time it's been living there, and then suddenly you give it pH 7.3 water that comes out of the tap, that can shock it. So we'll generally take water, whether it's RO or just relatively clean tap water, and just adjust the pH down to a value that's more akin to what we would normally use for watering the plants. That also helps dissolve some of the excess salts in the soil, but you don't want to overdo it. So somewhere pH 6.3 to 6.5 generally for flushing, but we don't add anything else. Except possibly there are some products on the market that are marketed as flushing agents. These things can help remove salts from media and can help get the plant down to a low nutrient level faster. A lot of these things are relatively simple flushing agents, and looking at the ingredients, it kind of makes sense why they would work. At the same time, plain water, just do it enough, certainly works well as anything with the flushing agents. You may just have to do it a couple more times.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit. You cover what's in there. What about volume? You have a good rule of thumb for a volume of water. So let's say I've been watering a 4x4. Let's just take a simple kind of standard space. And let's say I've been putting, I'll throw out, say, 10 gallons of water in there with every feeding throughout the grow cycle, throughout the flower cycle. What would you approach for flushing that instead of 10 gallons, or would you use 10 gallons?
Well, so taking your example, if you had 10 gallons that you were generally watering with every other day, for example, and you were getting some run through with that 10 gallons, which is what you want, then what I would just default to doing for the first flush would be double that, 20 gallons of water. And again, I would not apply that all at once. What I would do is give them a normal amount. So the 10 gallons up front, you get a little bit of run through. That gets the soil really nice and wet. And then wait a couple hours and go back and apply the second 10 gallons.
Now, I assume I don't want to wait overnight to where they start to dry out. It defeats the purpose. So how long would you say is a good window? Anywhere from an hour to? It
depends on how quickly they dry out. The longer you wait, the more is going to be liberated up. But at the same time, you're better off doing 3 flushes over an 8-hour period than 2 flushes over an 8-hour period, just because the more times you flush things through, it's diluting it more and more, and it's actually going to get more of the salts out of the soil or whatever media you're using.
And that's actually a good point, is you were talking about early that if you're flowering in flower, let's say we're targeting to be feeding every other day. For those of you that don't know, one of the most common problems with especially beginners in growing plants is overwatering, not underwatering, but overwatering. And while overwatering is not the amount, it's the frequency. So if we have a good dry back and we're able to cycle every 2 days, that's great. And we don't want to water every day because we would probably overwater and kill that plant. But when we get into flush, remember, we are signaling the plant it's time to die anyway. So if we rot the roots a little bit. I have a hard time saying that. Rot the roots a little bit. That's not the end of the world, and we're killing the plant anyway. So just to point out the difference here, when we're in flush, there's nothing wrong with flushing 2 days in a row, as Kevin was just saying. We wouldn't necessarily do that in flower.
Or even 3 times in the same day.
Yeah, so we're killing the plant anyway. You're not going to destroy it in a week and a half, in a 7 to 14-day flush cycle by hammering it with water. So just to be clear, that does also change when you move from feeding into the flushing time of your grow.
But the plants, and once you start doing flushing, the plants will tell you when they are flushing adequately because you're removing nutrients from the plant and from the plant media that it's growing in. You will notice that the plant is going to start showing signs of nutrient deficiencies. It's going to start getting fall-like colors. It's going to start developing chlorosis in its leaves, so yellowing leaves. If you're playing with the temperature as well, or depending on the exact strains you're growing, oftentimes you'll start seeing red or purple pigmentation coming out. These are all signs that the plant is starting to get to the end of its life cycle. It's losing nutrients. It needs more nutrients, which is exactly where we want it. So the flush is something where oftentimes we generally do a 10-day flush or plan on a 10-day flush, and we'll start flushing very heavily at the beginning of the 10 days. If we don't see any signs in the plant, if the plants are still as healthy and green and vibrant looking as ever, then we'll continue aggressively flushing. If the plants are starting to show signs of flushing and turning yellow or red or purple, then we continue the flush, but we no longer do it aggressively because we've already seen that the plants are getting affected by it already. So it's pretty easy to tell just visually whether or not your flush is actually having the desired effect. And every strain is going to be different. Every growing setup is probably going to be a little bit different. So it's one of those things you want to start, 10 days, 7 days before you're planning to harvest, just to make sure that you have enough time in there. But you may only have to aggressively flush for 2 to 3 days before you start seeing signs of that really taking effect.
That's a good point. We have some plants that we're happy just when they get a little light yellow, whereas some of ours will turn full fall colors. If you want to see some of my favorite examples of a good flush, we'll give a shout out to one of our friends on Instagram is Miss Rat Reefer. She's out in California. And if you just scroll through her Instagram feed, you will see some of the most beautiful pictures of a flush, or as a lot of people in the industry call it, the fade. They'll say my plants are fading well, check out this fade. They're talking about the flushing process. And some of the colors that she gets in her flushes on the fall leaves are just it's gorgeous. It's like being in Vermont in the fall. Beautiful.
And Miss Rad Reefer somehow manages to get them to do it in a beautifully symmetrical way. And of course, she always takes the pictures, the best ones. And they're really quite stunning photographs, actually.
Yeah, it's worth checking out. So that's a good way to see what Kevin's talking about as far as what your kind of goal is. But don't feel bad if yours don't look like hers, because ours don't either. So now we're flushing. We've talked about the volume. We've talked about what's in the water. We're getting towards the end here. So let's say as you're doing this, you're observing the flush. But remember, we're also observing the trichomes changing. And this should even hopefully speed that up and perpetuate that even further. And we're going to get to a point where we're ready to harvest. So now your plants are where you want them. The flush is there, so you're not going to get a harsh smoke. You've got the trichome amber where you wanted, let's say 5, 10, whatever you were personally shooting for this particular strain. Now it's time to harvest. So there's really not much more to do. There are some things, and I will say the jury's still out. Kevin might have a different opinion, but there are some other things you can do right at the end. A lot of growers I know like to do a dark cycle right before they take down. So they'll go 24 hours right before harvest of darkness. Kill the lights, kill the room, and keep in mind during this flush to get those colors out. Kevin spoke about it earlier. It's not just what we're feeding them, but we're also going to play with the environment to signal that end of life. So during the flush, during this 7, 10, 14 days, we are generally ramping down our temperatures. We will end as low as the AC will go, generally down in the 60 or 65, depending on your particular air conditioning unit. We'll try to end around there so it's as cold as we can get. And then also part of that is we will ramp down humidity. That is another signal, and it's also, we think it's a good thing to help prevent the molds and mildews as your buds are packing on their last weight and densing up really well at the end there. So we've got this, it's time to harvest. We've done maybe a dark cycle, and we're really ready to pull down. So you could do a dark cycle, but now it's time to pull down.
Yeah, and just to talk really quickly about the dark cycle, it's not so much that the plant knows anything different about going 36 hours without light. It's that by going 36 hours without light, you're keeping the plant cool. And at the very end, the plant is continuously producing more of these terpenes, which are very volatile compounds. They evaporate off the plant. That's why the tents smell so much when you're growing because these terpenes are constantly evaporating off. So by giving them a final dark period, the last day before harvest, you're allowing the plant to create more of these terpenes, but fewer of them are evaporating off. So it can increase the quality of your bud at the very end by giving it a dark, cold period at the very end. That allows the plant to hold on to more of the terpenes when you're actually processing them.
Yeah, and as more understanding is coming around that, I was just listening to a talk by a very good commercial grower in Arizona. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the grow, but they have a trademark name. It's called Cold Cure. They're really big on curing at very low temperatures, as Kevin was saying, to preserve all those volatile compounds and get you the best flower possible. So we also cure at as cold as we can get. They have more industrial equipment, but when we do our own grow, we definitely all personally cure at as low temp as we can with the proper humidity, but we do try and keep the temps low to preserve those terpenes. So now you got your time done, you got everything you want, you're like, perfect, it's time to harvest. Harvesting, we've covered it in some others. Our kits, as we talked about before, you can observe the trichomes. Our kits come with a microscope. All of them come with a microscope, a little handheld loop, so you can really look at those trichomes and see what's going on. And of course, we include scissors and drying racks to do the harvest and all that. So from this point on, it's really simple. You're going into the harvest. You're going to take your stuff down. You can you can trim wet. You can trim dry. No right or wrong, just a personal preference. Some of it comes down to, if you're taking a bunch of flower down a 4x4 tent and you're alone, you're not going to want to do that in one sitting. And that's a case where you might want to go ahead and dry it on the plant and then just trim it at your leisure over time instead of trying to take it all down and trim it all wet right away. So there are considerations, and we will do a future episode specifically around the drying, curing, and harvesting process. But this is we want to talk about how what your signals are, what you're trying to accomplish in those last couple critical weeks. Everyone talks about growing. They talk about the veg cycle, the flower cycle. But I can tell you, so many people get through all that, and then either during the takedown or the curing process, they ruin all that work with making some critical mistakes. So we hate to see you spend 8 or 10 weeks going down the road with your flower and tending to your plants. And if you add veg, even more time, and just to have it wasted at the end with a bad takedown or a bad process. So really learn a little bit about that, because it's not mindless, it's not super complex, but you should know a little bit about what you're doing. So anything you want to talk about more on that, Kevin, as far as the cure, not the curing, but the actual flushing process the last couple of weeks, things we should tell the listeners about that?
Not anything that I can think of.
So the other thing I'd say is when you look at flowers, one thing that I personally don't like is when you get flowers that go too long and you'll get what's called a dreading effect or the bud shape changes. So yes, the smell matters, the trichome production, all those things, but you might also, one other fun thing to observe is what happens to the flower as it matures. It might look beautiful for a while, and then if you push it from 9 to 10 weeks, it's putting on more weight, but it doesn't have a nice bud structure, a nice flower structure anymore. You don't like the way it looks. So those are all things, again, there is no right or wrong, and go with your personal preference. If you learn that particular genetic, you really like how it looks and feels at week 9, then you can start taking it down at week 9 instead of week 10. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're okay with any weight loss. If you realize, I don't care if I could pack on that extra gram because I really prefer the bud at 9 weeks. Hey, it's your grow. That's the beauty of growing your own. You're not stuck with what you could buy in the store. You have control over your own garden, and that is the part of the joy of gardening. So we will, like I said, cover in the future some harvesting stuff about the harvest and trim and cure process. We've covered in the past and some stuff, and we'll continue to cover that in the future because that is also a critical process. But thank you again for listening today. We hope you enjoyed this installment of Cultivation Cast. If you have any questions about the content, you want more detail on something, by all means hit us up on our blog, hit us up through our website, send us an email podcast@blackdogled.com. Of course, just give us a shout at the office, and if you're local to the Denver area, come visit us in our office. So thanks again for joining us at Cultivation Cast, and we'll see you guys soon. Happy gardening.